I want to welcome into live at the forum some of my partners, DeWayne Street and Rudy Racine from Equus. And I think we're gonna go. There they are. Well, I love DeWayne. I love the bow tie.
Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, my friend. How are you, Ron?
I think I'm doing good, Rudy. How are you?
Fantastic. Thank you for having us.
Yes.
No, it's really you're more than welcome. It's a recognition of a great partner in Equus, and it's just great to have you guys join me. And now that we've said hello, I'm going to go back and do the formal part of this, and then we want to talk about what work you guys are involved in and what's next. So I'm going to start with DeWayne Street. He serves as the Regional Director for Workforce Services at Equus. He also serves at Midway Diversity Solutions. At Midway Diversity, Street serves as the Virtual Chief Diversity Officer, where he presents diversity workshops, gives keynotes, and describes himself as a global presenter. DeWayne works towards creating inclusive, culturally competent environments where people work and live, guiding clients in transforming their workplace climate by implementing diversity plans to increase productivity. He holds a bachelor's degree in history, poli-sci, and education from Alabama State University, and a master's degree in adult continuing education from Northern Illinois University. Rudy Racine is the Vice President of WeCARE operations for, I guess, Equus now, Rudy, where he is tasked with leading one of New York City's largest vocational rehabilitation programs. Under his leadership, Rudy's team works to address the needs of cash assistance clients who are dealing with medical or mental health barriers to employment. Big population we need to talk about, by providing customized assistance. He served previously as the regional recruiter, hiring for Enterprise Rent-A-Car in New York metro area. He has served as the Director of Career Services for DeVry College of New York. He held a similar role at Mount Washington College in Southern New Hampshire. He holds an MBA from the Keller Graduate School of Management and a Bachelor of Business Administration from Hofstra University. So DeWayne and Rudy, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Ron.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Guys, it sounds like you don't have a problem filling up your day.
Not at all.
DeWayne, let's talk about filling up your day. This is a crazy time
Yes.
right now with lots of people who are out there trying to figure out what's next. What are you guys seeing, and what kind of what's the reaction? What are you seeing? What are people talking about as you guys meet them? Right? Because Equus is across the country, large provider.
I can speak to what's happening here in Texas. I'm the regional director for West Texas. And to your point, Ron, there's a lot going on right now. I mean, people are concerned about COVID-19. People are concerned about what's happening in the streets, the call for social justice. All those things are happening. And part of our challenge is to get our workforce focused on how each of us can make a contribution in terms of using employment to emancipate people from marginalization. And at the same time, making sure that we keep everyone safe as we experience in Texas a rise in COVID-19 numbers. So there's a lot of uncertainty going on right now. A lot of people are very concerned, but fortunately, our project directors are doing a really good job of helping people stay focused. But I think it's not to be unexpected that sometimes that does seep into the work. And so I think we need to embrace that.
DeWayne, are you seeing that? I don't know. Let me just say from my perspective. In the past, those were almost separate conversations. Like inclusion, diversity, what is happening in the Black community, almost seemed like it was a separate conversation from workforce development and from talent utilization. Are you seeing more of that conversation going together? Are you more hopeful that we're going to have that conversation together?
Yes, I am. And I think, Ron, excuse me, part of it is the changing demographics, right? I mean, we have an older population. The baby boomers are leaving the workforce in record numbers. And so I think the conversation now has been forced to look at what I call the non-traditional pipelines. And I think that's exciting because a lot of people who typically have been left out of the workforce are now being included out of necessity. So I do think, to your point, there is this merging of those two conversations, which is extremely rewarding and exciting. And it's what I think should have happened a long time ago, but we'll take it for what it is now. It's a moment that we have to seize, because we can take people who've been historically marginalized and put them in a workforce system that is responsive to their needs. I'm all over that.
So I'm gonna ask a very unfair question, because I'm gonna ask you to participate, and Rudy jump in as well. I'm gonna ask you guys to participate in a conversation to help me learn. So obviously, if somebody's watching the video, I am like, unlike what maybe my niece and nephew would describe me. I'm not going to describe me as an old white guy. I'm just going to say I'm a white guy. So obviously, in my mind, I did not grow up as a young black man. I did not grow up with that experience. So how do we approach this conversation?
So, Rudy, please feel free to chime in. I think the first thing, Ron, is, and we talked about this in a presentation that Rudy and I just gave less than 30 minutes ago. And one of the things that we're struggling with is there hasn't been a reconciliation of the facts of what happened in our country. It's almost like we're two ships in a fog bank, and from time to time we bump up against each other to remind each other that we're out there, but we're not in the middle where all of us can rely on the facts about how we arrived at this place. And I think we need people who can drive the conversation using history to connect the present, because people have to understand how we arrived here so we can give them the impetus to have that conversation, because it takes away any fear of a personal attack. There are historical drivers behind what we're seeing at this moment in time. And I think we have to educate people about that so that we can have a conversation based on honesty and truth and not based on perception, because there's still this belief that if you're discussing these things, then you're bashing America, or you really don't believe in, and that's not true. I mean, I think the greatest thing a patriot can do is to call your country to its highest ideals of what it put on paper, because we believe in the country. So I think that's the greatest thing that we can do, but we have to have a reconciliation of the facts and not feelings. And the last point I'll say is that diversity work has to be operational, not aspirational. For too long, it's been aspirational. Use the data to drive the conversation. The data will show you what the next steps will be.
Rudy, is this kind of like, hard for me to think back that far, but I mean, is this sort of like we're back in the, I don't know, 7th grade, 8th grade, and we're going to the 8th grade dance, and oh my God, there are girls. I don't know how to talk. If I open my mouth, I'm going to sound stupid.
So Ron, I think
are we at that point?
Well, I think we are at a point where it's important to acknowledge that this is not an easy conversation to have. It's important to acknowledge that, from the stance of an African-American male, not every African-American male or female is also equipped to have that conversation or prepared to have that conversation, right? So you ask, how does a white male engage in that conversation? I think it varies depending on the person that you're speaking to and how comfortable they are with speaking about their experiences. I think one of the most important pieces, or one of the most important things that you want to do when initiating this conversation, is just open it up with, be open to what you hear, listen without judgment, and listen to the best of your ability to understand. Because everyone's situation, everyone's experience is very different. Every African-American male has experienced racism at different levels. So there isn't a best practice or an easy answer or easy way to have the conversation. It's really just to try to engage, give the person on the other side the opportunity to share their experience. And if they're not ready to share their experience, no need to push the envelope. Just offer the opportunity to have a conversation when they're ready.
I did a podcast recently with a young black man, a great guy whom I'm getting to know, Paul Spradley. He does a lot of work in this area. He's a former career counselor, still calls himself a career counselor. But interesting, one of the things that Paul said was that the conversation has to mature to the point where if I'm practicing what I would call, and a lot of the one-stops, and I want to ask you guys about this, if I'm maturing to where I'm talking about human-centered design, and I'm talking about like what's best for my customer, how do I deliver customer-centered design, then he said, aren't I an important part of your customer base? And so isn't this, in a way, isn't this just good human-centered design? Yes. I'm looking to redesign the services that I'm offering because the population I'm trying to reach are young black men. And this is not. How are you guys reaching, like, first of all, I guess, and really tough question. There are tens of thousands of people on the front line of this issue across the American job centers and across workforce boards across the country. Like, what can we do better to help them with this conversation? Are you optimistic that now is the time?
I'm very optimistic that now is the time. I know one of the things that we do is we're always engaging and training around cultural competency. I mean, I think that's extremely important because a culturally competent practice is an effective practice. And the things that, because of the changing demographics, you can't practice the way you did in 1996. The demographics are different. Right? I know. And there are people who still want to unpack
what
that.
About like 1980?
Right, exactly. Oh, I'm being
in my world here.
I know. And so, and we have to engage in a culturally competent practice, and it's ongoing, Ron. It can't just be once a year we have diversity training because the situation is so fluid, so dynamic. We have to give people the tools to manage that reality and to meet the needs of the people who are coming in. In the words of Booker T. Washington, you have to cast down your buckets where you are. Okay, if we're seeing a different demographic, then we have to design a practice to meet the needs of that demographic. So we do a lot around cultural competency training. We do a lot around having people, in the words of Dr. Ross, admit their own biases. Everyone has bias. That's not the enemy. Making it operational is what we have to guard against, because once it becomes operational, we're not meeting our outcomes. We're not meeting the commitments we made to the community, and we're not using employment to emancipate people from marginalization. We have to admit that we all have biases. And to Rudy's point, just because you look like me doesn't mean you won't discriminate against me. So we have to make sure that we look at all that.
Rudy, you do some work in an area that really faces even more perceptual issues. People who are suffering from mental and physical health issues. How does, what do we need to be looking at? And how do we blend that? If that's a good word. How do we blend that population better into the workplace? Do you see, like, during the pandemic, we've all learned, or some of us better than others, how to work virtually. Mm-hmm. We've often thought that automation might be one of the great liberators for this. Do you see that potential?
Absolutely. I think the clientele that we work with in the WeCARE program, often, or many, if not all of our clients in WeCARE have medical or mental health barriers, but the level of severity that they are experiencing varies, right? So those that are employable with limitations, requiring vocational rehabilitation services, we work with those individuals to help them to develop their skills and enhance their skills to increase their chances of finding employment. But I think we do a really good job of, helping individuals identify that their medical or mental health barrier is a barrier that can be overcome. And in many instances, there are positions out there, there are jobs out there that can be done that don't go beyond that individual's medical or mental health barrier. So I think oftentimes when we have clients that come to us, they aren't aware of the opportunities. In some cases, we have clients that were accustomed to doing a job previously, and then they got injured or something happened to them, which caused them to have this medical or mental health barrier. So they can't do the job that they were able to do before. And when you talk to them about work to them from their perspective is the work that they used to do.
It's what they used to do.
So it is our job to kind of expand on the definition of work and show them the opportunities that exist outside of what they may have been able to do previously, and help them to develop and gain that training so that they're aware of the possibilities beyond what they used to do. And I think we do a good job of that.
Mm-hmm.
So, DeWayne, I'm an employer. I'm wrestling. I'm trying to think like what's the right thing for me to do, and maybe I know what the right thing for me to do is. Can you talk to me about maybe the next point that really sends me over the edge is the economic point.
Yeah.
How is my business better
Mm-hmm.
if I really, and I think we've talked a lot today on the panel and elsewhere around intentionality.
Mm-hmm.
I've been talking to a lot of my friends lately, and the word is about intentional. How do what's the benefit for me? And I guess, Rudy, then I'm going to ask you the same question on the disability side.
Right.
What's the economic?
Oh, excellent question. There are studies now which prove that diverse organizations are more profitable than organizations that are not diverse. I mean, and the literature is very clear on that. I'm sorry, you were going to say.
No.
Yeah. And so the literature is very clear on that. But I also think, too, that no one group of people can have all the answers. I mean, we have to cultivate diversity of thought, because once we get to diversity of thought, then we'll have physical diversity. And then that leads to all these different ideas coming into the workplace, which leads to innovation. But there is clear data that more diverse organizations are more profitable. And it's not just the physical diversity that I seek diversity of thought, because we need people who understand how to look at problems differently, because this is probably the most complex environment we've seen as a country since probably 1968. And I say that as a historian. And we need people who can look at this and design solutions in terms of the workforce, and how do you use the workforce to drive change in terms of communities? How do we use the workforce to uplift entire communities so that we won't have people in the streets? So I think this is a time where we use the data and we start looking at, just because everyone looks like me doesn't mean that this is the only place for me to be. I want people who ask this question, Ron, why is it that there are no people of color in this leadership team? Why is it that's normal? Because once we get people to that point, then we open the door for that diversity of thought and that physical diversity. I want people to challenge the normalcy of marginalization.
And just to add to that, I think, the communities that we work in and the communities that we work for, it is imperative that our organizations mirror those communities, right?
Exactly.
So we can speak until we're blue in the face about wanting to change communities, but if our leadership team, if our employees don't mirror those communities, it's very difficult to gain their buy-in, and it's very difficult to kind of get the message across. So it's interesting. I saw Senator Al Green asked a panel of CEOs, bank CEOs. He said, raise your hand or stand up if your successor is going to be a person of color or a woman, and none of them stood up. And that's telling.
Yeah.
So, for organizations that are watching this, for those that are in leadership, think to yourself, what are you doing to help further people of color and women in your workplace? How are you working with them to help them grow into leadership positions so that your leadership mirrors the community that you're servicing? I think that's an important conversation to have.
Exactly.
would you both agree that intentional is
Yes.
a pretty important word that we've got to label this? So tell me about, like, if you're going to start training, or you're going to start this conversation, what are some examples of everyday biases that I'm guessing most of us don't even think about?
I think when you look at what you're referring to is the unspoken, right? I mean, yeah, because people are very good at knowing what not to say, but diversity work in the 21st century is about surfacing the unspoken. An example would be if an African American is speaking in front of leadership and they make a grammatical mistake, that's seen as a commentary on their intellect as opposed to simply a mistake. These are just inherent biases that a lot of people have, not all people, that when a woman walks into the room, she's judged based on her appearance versus her intellect. These are biases that we all have. And what I try to do, and what we try to do as a company, is to surface the unspoken so that it's not present in our practice. And you start that conversation with the leadership, because a lot of people want to go to the front line. It's the leadership where it has to start, because they have to model the behavior that they want to see out of the frontline staff. And they have to also be able to identify their own biases in real time so that they don't make them operational. That's how I would start the conversation. And then you look at data. I mean, I'm a big proponent of what Deming said. In God we trust, but everyone else better have data. Okay. I mean,
This really, I mean, and DeWayne, I do have to say, like, many people know that I claim my hometown is Pittsburgh.
Oh yeah.
So when I say yins, like, people look at me and they have thought process.
Yes.
We're kind of talking about, I mean, this is a tough conversation, but we're really talking about some common sense kind of approaches to this. You talked about the data. I think, Rudy, you talked about looking at the inherent, like, what's the talent we need and what's the talent this person has regardless, and we can move forward. What do you both want to see out of, like, workforce boards across the country? What do you want to see workforce boards do? How do you want to see them be intentional as we collectively are on the front line of this issue?
I think, and DeWayne is the historian, and he has data to back up everything he says.
And I am so proud that
and I love it.
A side degree and he's working. Like,
yes, and I love it.
So, my undergraduate degree.
I try to let him speak first all the time because he backs his stuff up with data and metrics. But I can say that one thing that I would love to see from workforce boards is just the ability to connect employers with diversity and inclusion training, so that they know how to have conversations with their staff. They know how to identify talent and identify what their biases are. I think one common practice for an organization that lacks diversity is when the organization has few or limited minorities in their employed with them, and when something happens, when a social issue happens, they turn to that individual to be the representative, to speak on behalf of the race, right? And not every individual is prepared to have those conversations I mentioned earlier. And DeWayne, he says this, and I love when he says this. He says, I want to be looked at as DeWayne, who is African-American, not an African-American who happens to be DeWayne, right? So we are unique individuals, and when you're in an organization that lacks diversity and that understanding, oftentimes you put employees in a predicament where they are asked to represent their entire race and speak on behalf of their entire race. So one thing that I think workforce boards can do is really connect organizations with that those opportunities to get trained around diversity, to get trained around having these difficult conversations, and becoming aware of the biases that might exist within their organization. That's the first step, I think, in my opinion.
So right now we're dealing with, I think collectively, but again, one of my biases is workforce boards and one stops, the American Job Centers who are on the front line. There's a lot of anger out there. Mm-hmm. Karen mentioned it this morning, and I've seen, in other places. I walk down the street here in DC and the buildings are boarded up. There's a lot of anger. Where does that feeling start? Mm-hmm. And if, as you guys are talking to your frontline staff, how are you telling them to, like, we're gonna work forward? Mm-hmm. How does that start? What do you say to me? I'm on the front line. I'm facing this anger.
Mm-hmm. I think it goes back to Rudy talked about listening, and Ron, you talked about being intentional. I think as leaders, when we address frontline staff, I think we have to get to a place where they know that they're being heard, but I also think we have to help them reinforce their raincoat so that they don't see this anger as a personal attack, because once you personalize it, it seeps into your practice and then you become part of the problem. I was a long-time educator. I worked in corrections, and you have to have a raincoat when you work in those environments. And it's the same way you work with people in general. And then we have to give them the tools through training to make sure that their raincoat is not punctured, because when it's punctured, then they do internalize it, and that anger, it just becomes part of a contagion that infests or implicates or destroys the entire center at that point. So we have to do a better job.
Isn't that a really tough thing to do, though? Because we're in a business where we sort of wear our concern, our passions on our sleeves. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, I was going to say, you talked about the anger that's being experienced, and I want to touch on that. Anger is an emotion, just like enthusiasm, happiness, frustration. It's all emotions, right? And there are levels of listening. So there's listening to understand, there's listening to respond, and there is listening beyond the words, right? So 3 levels of listening. You heard subjective, objective, and intuitive. So in workforce, when you're faced with someone that is experiencing the emotion that is called anger, if you're listening to respond, then you're not really listening. You are kind of picking up on areas where you might agree or disagree, and you're making it about yourself. The next level of listening is objective listening, and that's listening to understand. And when you listen to understand, before you comment, you replay what you heard the other person say. So what I'm hearing you say is you're angry because, and then you fill in the blank. And that allows the person that you're speaking to feel heard and feel like you're acknowledging their emotions. And then the highest level of listening is intuitive listening, right? So when you're able to listen to the anger, and without the individual saying that they're angry, you can hear the anger in what they're saying. And you might say, well, I'm hearing that, you've been racially profiled on multiple occasions, and you felt that you were passed over for opportunities on multiple occasions. And, if I can imagine if anyone experienced the things that you've experienced, they would be angry, right? So now you've put the emotion out there, and you listened to them intuitively. They didn't say they were angry, but you kind of pointed out that any person that experienced frustration, rejection, judgment because of race might result in an individual feeling angry. So I think it starts long response short is really learning how to listen effectively. And I think listening is the root, it's the foundation. Yes. If you can learn how to listen intuitively and listen objectively, it's the first step to making these conversations a little bit easier to have.
I agree. And I think one of the things I would add, Ron, is that I always say to staff is that when a person comes in, our goal is to get them to a better place, not to get in that space with them. And I think if you keep that central to your practice, and I know it's hard sometimes because you're right, we are passionate about what we do.
To me again, if you're trying to get them to a better place. You're not trying to get into their place.
Yes, exactly. I mean, because a lot of times I think that staff get into that negative space with them. And from that moment on, it almost becomes like a case of professional Munchausen. We can't allow that. We have to get them out of that space, okay? I mean, that's our goal. And to Rudy's point, we can listen, we can empathize, and we can be sincere in practice, but our goal is to move them to a better place. Because once we stop acknowledging that, then I think we become part of the problem. And another thing I say to staff is be passionate, but not be prejudicial. It's okay to be passionate, but let's not be prejudicial. Let's not just look at a situation and form a judgment.
This is probably a loaded question, but I mean, do we spend enough time as a system talking about these issues, trying to help the front line educate them on these issues?
I could say we could do better. We can always do better. Yep. We can do a lot better on that front. Mm-hmm.
Again, I think it's a difficult conversation to have. I think when trying to facilitate or navigate a conversation around these issues, it's very easy to step in a minefield and have the conversation deteriorate to something that's not productive.
Right.
So as a result, people will avoid having the conversations as opposed to having it head on. I think these conversations, there's different levels that you can engage in a conversation like this. You can engage at the lowest level, which is like avoidance or victim. There's the conflict, which is slightly higher than avoidance and victim. There's coping, and then the next level is concern. So approaching it from a level of concern is one of the best ways to do it. And then a higher level than that is collaboration. So, engaging in this conversation not only helps the individual, but it also helps you. So being able to look at it as a win-win is the start. So when you can engage in a conversation about race, racism, marginalization from a place of collaboration, knowing that having this conversation is not only going to help your staff, but also help you and your organization and continuing along that line, I think that's the start of it.
So I'm getting told we're running out of time. So that leads me to my first question. You're both going to promise me you're going to come back and we're going to continue the conversation, right?
Yes, sir. Yep.
Sure, absolutely.
And I think until we do that, DeWayne, Rudy, some suggestions about how do we create that safe space? What are the first steps to create a safe space for us to, I think, DeWayne, you mentioned surface these biases.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How do we do that?
I think, first of all, we have to acknowledge that everyone has bias, and as leaders, we have to say that. So we give people the opportunity to have those conversations where they say, you know what, Ron, I am struggling with this. This is how I see this situation. And I think we need to divine intent and withhold judgment. A lot of times when a person admits that they are struggling with an issue of diversity, people come down on that person to the point like they're an evil individual. No, surfacing your concerns and your biases is a good thing. And then the second thing is start a leadership meeting by looking at the data. It's a non-judgmental way to start the conversation.
Cool.
I would just say, I was going to say 80-20. 80-20, right? So listen, 80% listening, 20% speaking. I think when it comes to uncomfortable conversations and difficult conversations, oftentimes there's too much words, too much explaining and apologizing, and just acknowledge, listen, I'm not sure what the best way to have this conversation is.
Right.
I want to hear from you. Talk to me. What can I do? And then stop talking and listen.
Yep. And people of color.
80-20. Do you think if I'd have learned 80-20, I'd still be married? No, you guys, truly, you don't have to answer that question. That is really. Rudy Racine and DeWayne Street, thank you, truly thank you for joining me. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to getting you guys scheduled so we can have a longer conversation.
Thank you. So do we. Thank you so much.
Thanks again, Ron. Appreciate it.
Welcome. Thanks, guys.